In the late 11th century, Europe and the Middle East were at a major turning point in history. The Mediterranean, long split between Christian and Islamic influences, was about to see a series of military campaigns that would change political borders, cultural exchanges, and religious relationships for centuries. The Byzantine Empire, once the powerful eastern half of the Roman Empire, faced increasing threats from Turkish forces in Anatolia. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, worried about losing territory and under military pressure, reached out to Western Europe for help. Little did he know, this decision would lead to consequences he couldn't have imagined. At the same time, Europe was going through some big changes. The feudal system had created a bunch of land-hungry knights and nobles, and population growth was putting a strain on farming. Religious devotion was a huge part of everyday life, with many Christians seeing pilgrimages to holy sites as the ultimate act of faith. Jerusalem, the city where Christ lived and died, was especially important in the medieval Christian mindset. The relationship between Western and Eastern Christianity was getting pretty rocky. The Great Schism of 1054 had officially split Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, leading to a lot of suspicion and resentment that would make cooperation during the upcoming conflicts with the Islamic world really tough. Political fragmentation replaced the earlier unity of the Abbasid Caliphate, with Seljuk Turks, Fatimids, and local emirates all competing for power and territory in the Middle East. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, but Christian pilgrims were generally allowed to visit holy sites, an arrangement that was about to be threatened by changing political dynamics. This complicated mix of religious zeal, political ambition, economic need, and cultural misunderstandings set the stage for what we now call the Crusades. When Pope Urban II spoke at the Council of Clermont in November 1095, he sparked a movement that would rally tens of thousands and create a new chapter in the relationship between Europe and the Middle East. The call to reclaim Jerusalem struck a chord across Europe, attracting people from all walks of life. For some, it was about spiritual redemption through holy battles. For others, it was a chance for land, wealth, or adventure in far-off lands. The crusading movement would stretch nearly 2 centuries, covering 9 major campaigns and countless smaller ones, each with its own vibe, leaders, and outcomes. What started as a response to the Byzantine plea for military support turned into a complex phenomenon that's hard to pin down. It wasn't just religious or purely secular, and it wasn't a total success or a complete failure. The Crusades left a lasting impact on 3 major civilizations, shaping memories and stories that still influence international relations and religious discussions today. The First Crusade kicked off at a huge gathering during the Council of Clermont in November 1095. That's where Pope Urban II gave a passionate speech that changed the course of history for both Europe and the Middle East. Standing in front of a crowd of clergy and nobles, Urban painted a vivid picture of Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule and holy sites being controlled by non-Christians. From the heart of Jerusalem to the city of Constantinople, a grim story emerged. Urban proclaimed, "An outside race has invaded the lands of Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire." He wrapped up his appeal with a powerful call to arms. "Undertake this journey for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven." This message really struck a chord. Urban promised complete forgiveness of sins to anyone who joined the fight, which was a huge deal in a society where salvation was everything. The crowd responded immediately, with many shouting, "Dies vult," God wills it, which became the battle cry of the crusading movement. The crusade that followed unfolded in two main phases. The first, known as the People's Crusade, showcased the enthusiasm Urban's preaching had sparked among the general population. Led by a charismatic French monk named Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants, townsfolk, and minor knights set off for Jerusalem in the spring of 1096, months before the organized military forces were ready to go. Lacking military discipline, proper supplies, or strong leadership, these early crusaders left a trail of destruction across Europe. Jewish communities in the Rhineland faced particularly brutal attacks, as some crusaders decided that enemies of Christ were closer to home. When the People's Crusade reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios, alarmed by their behavior and numbers, quickly transported them across the Bosphorus. By October 1096, Turkish forces wiped out most of this undisciplined army near Nicaea, bringing the People's Crusade to a disastrous end. The second phase, known as the Prince's Crusade, was more organized and formidable. Four main groups led by prominent nobles set out from different parts of Europe in August and September 1096. From Lorraine came Godfrey of Bouillon, a pious and disciplined military leader who had sold or mortgaged most of his lands to fund his expedition. His brothers Baldwin and Eustace joined him. From southern Italy, the Norman Bohemond of Taranto led a smaller but highly skilled force. A seasoned warrior who had previously fought against the Byzantines, Bohemond brought a mix of martial experience and personal ambition. From southern France, Count Raymond of Toulouse commanded the largest group. Though he was around 55 old by medieval standards, Raymond was a devoted crusader who had formerly vowed to reach Jerusalem. From northern France came forces led by Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Stephen of Blois, each powerful in their own right, but lacking the singular leadership seen in other groups. By early 1097, these armies had converged at Constantinople, where they met a suspicious emperor, Alexios. The emperor demanded oaths of loyalty and promises to return former Byzantine territories. Most leaders agreed, though with varying levels of sincerity. Byzantine guides and supplies were provided, and the combined Crusader army crossed into Anatolia. Their first major battle was at Nicaea, the Turkish capital in western Anatolia, which fell in June 1097 after a coordinated siege with the Byzantines. The following month at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders successfully repelled a major Turkish counterattack, securing their path through Anatolia. As they moved eastward, the army faced scorching heat, limited water, and harassment from Turkish forces. In October 1097, they reached Antioch, a city protected by massive walls and hundreds of towers. What followed was a grueling 8-month siege that tested the Crusaders' resolve. Starvation, disease, and desertion plagued their camp as winter set in. The situation grew so desperate that some knights, including the prominent leader Stephen of Blois, abandoned the effort. The tide turned through a mix of perseverance and clever maneuvering. Bohemond made contact with an Armenian guard commander named Firuz, who agreed to betray the city. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Bohemond's men scaled the walls at a section under Firuz's command, opened the gates, and the Crusader army poured into Antioch. However, the victory was short-lived. Just 3 days later, a massive relief army led by Kerbuga of Mosul arrived, trapping the exhausted Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. With retreat impossible and supplies running low, morale plummeted. At this critical moment, a remarkable event revitalized the Crusader cause. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received visions revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. Despite some skepticism from leaders, an excavation in Antioch's cathedral uncovered an iron point. Whether it was real or made up, the discovery electrified the common soldiers. On June 28th, the reinvigorated Crusader army emerged from Antioch in battle formation. Against all military logic, they routed Kerbuga's superior force. Many Crusaders believed this victory was due to divine intervention, further solidifying their belief in the righteousness of their mission. The triumph at Antioch brought its own complications. Bohemond claimed the city as his prize, despite earlier promises to return conquered territories to Byzantine control. This established the First Crusader State, the Principality of Antioch, and set a precedent for future Crusader territorial acquisitions. After regrouping at Antioch, the crusade continued southward in January 1099, though their numbers had significantly dwindled due to combat, disease, and the garrison left in Antioch. Raymond of Toulouse emerged as the de facto leader, although tensions lingered among the commanders. The march down the Levantine coast went relatively smoothly, as local emirs often preferred negotiation over confrontation. By June 7, 1099, around 12,000 Crusaders reached Jerusalem, marking the end of a nearly 3-year journey spanning thousands of miles. Jerusalem, then under Fatimid Egyptian control, posed a formidable challenge with its massive walls and strong garrison. The Crusaders' initial assault on June 13th failed due to inadequate siege equipment. Realizing they needed better preparations, the leaders organized teams to build wooden towers, catapults, and other siege weapons. Meanwhile, the army suffered from extreme heat and water shortages, as local sources had been poisoned or drained by the defenders. On July 15th, after a night of religious processions around the city walls, the Crusaders launched their final assault. Godfrey's forces breached the northern wall, while Raymond's men entered from the southwest. What followed was a shocking bloodbath that horrified even those living in medieval times. The Crusaders, fueled by religious zeal and the hardships of their journey, slaughtered thousands of Jerusalem's inhabitants, Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians. Contemporary accounts describe streets flowing with blood and Crusaders wading ankle-deep through carnage. While some of this may be exaggerated, archaeological and primary sources confirm extensive violence against the civilian population. After the conquest, the Crusader leaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as the Fourth Crusader State, joining the county of Edessa, founded by Baldwin in 1098, the Principality of Antioch, claimed by Bohemond, and the county of Tripoli, later consolidated by Raymond's successors. Godfrey of Bouillon became the kingdom's first ruler, though he declined the title of king, preferring to be called Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Upon his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin I took on the royal title, formalizing the political structure of the new realm. The First Crusade did something that later missions just couldn't pull off. It conquered Jerusalem and set up Latin Christian states in the Levant. This incredible achievement came from a mix of factors: a burning passion for faith, solid military skills, and strong leadership, even with all the squabbles. But the biggest factor? The disunity among Muslim powers in the area. The Seljuk Turks and Fatimid Egyptians, who were usually rivals, just couldn't come together to fight off the common Christian threat until it was way too late. When Jerusalem fell, it sent shockwaves through Europe. Urban II, who kicked off the whole thing, sadly passed away before hearing about the victory. For many at the time, this win was proof that they had divine backing, setting the stage for a lasting Western presence in the Holy Land, and the Muslim response that would lead to more crusades. By the mid-1140s, the Crusader states that popped up after the First Crusade were really starting to feel the heat. The Muslim world, which had been pretty scattered during the Christian push, was now getting its act together politically and militarily. This shift in power kicked off with a major setback for the Christians: the fall of Edessa in December 1144. Ahmad al-Din Zandi, a Turkish atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, laid siege to Edessa and took it down in just one day. This city was the first Crusader state and the farthest east the Latin presence had reached. The Christian folks there faced massacre or enslavement, and the news of this shocking loss sent ripples through Europe. When Pope Eugenius III caught wind of Edessa's fall in the autumn of 1145, he knew it could spark a chain reaction. So, he issued the papal bull Quantum Predecessors, calling for a new crusade. But unlike Urban II's rallying cry 50 years earlier, this one didn't exactly set the world on fire. The political scene in Europe had changed, with kings more settled in their thrones and less eager to embark on distant adventures. Enter Bernard, the abbot of Clairvaux, who became the crusading movement's champion. He was a major religious figure with a magnetic personality and a strong moral compass. While the papal bull didn't light a fire, Bernard's passionate preaching did. At Vézelay in March 1146, he delivered a stirring sermon to King Louis VII of France and his court, which led to nobles tearing their clothes to make makeshift crosses, a classic symbol of crusade participation. Louis VII jumped on the crusading bandwagon with enthusiasm. Young and pious, he saw this as a chance to atone for a church fire in Vitry that had killed many. This crusade wasn't just a religious mission for him. It was also a big political statement, as France was starting to find its national identity. The crusade really picked up steam when Conrad III, the King of Germany and leader of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, decided to join in after Bernard's passionate preaching at Frankfurt. This made Conrad the first German king to take the cross, uniting two major powers of Western Europe in this campaign. A standout aspect of the Second Crusade was the involvement of Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who traveled alongside her husband, Louis. Smart, Strong-willed and politically savvy, Eleanor brought along a significant group from her extensive lands in southwestern France. Her presence really underscored the mix of religious fervor, political strategy, and personal motives that defined the crusading movement. This Second Crusade also stretched its reach beyond the usual Eastern Mediterranean battleground. Over in the Iberian Peninsula, crusading forces lent a hand to local Christian kingdoms fighting against Muslim territories in a parallel conflict known as the Reconquista. At the same time, Saxon nobles were busy launching campaigns against pagan Slavic tribes along the Baltic coast, linking crusading ideas to the expansion of German influence eastward. This geographic spread showed just how flexible the concept of crusading was, and how useful the rhetoric of holy war could be for political ends. The main Eastern expedition kicked off with a lot of promise, but quickly hit some bumps in the road. Conrad's German army was the first to set off in May 1147, taking the Danube route to Constantinople. Unfortunately, they were poorly disciplined and short on supplies, leading them to plunder Byzantine territory and creating tension with Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, who had reluctantly agreed to back the mission. The French army, on the other hand, was better organized and followed a similar path, but kept a tighter grip on discipline. When Louis finally reached Constantinople in October 1147, he discovered that the Germans had already pushed on into Anatolia. The Byzantine emperor, wary of Western intentions after the fallout from the First Crusade, offered guides but limited further help. Ignoring the emperor's advice to stick to the coastal route, Conrad led his troops straight across Anatolia's central plateau. Near Dorylaeum, where the First Crusade had celebrated victory, Conrad's army faced a crushing defeat at the hands of the Turks on October 25, 1147. The few surviving Germans retreated to Nicaea, where they found the French forces arriving in disarray. Louis decided to stick to the coastal route, but he soon faced his own challenges. Turkish attacks, tough terrain, and supply shortages gradually sapped the French morale and fighting spirit. By early 1148, when the Crusaders reached Antalya on the southern coast of Anatolia, things had gotten so bad that Louis abandoned the land route altogether. He and his nobles managed to secure ships to sail to Antioch, leaving behind thousands of common pilgrims and infantry, many of whom sadly perished or were captured. The arrival of the Crusades' remnants in Antioch in March 1148 brought a whole new set of challenges. Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch and Eleanor's uncle, was eager for the Crusaders to either help recapture Edessa or launch an attack on Aleppo, which was Zangi's stronghold. While these ideas fit the original goals of the Crusade, they clashed with what was strategically best for Jerusalem. To make matters more complicated, personal and political tensions were brewing. Eleanor was all for her uncle's suggestions, and some sources even hinted at a rather close relationship developing between her and Raymond. This didn't sit well with Louis, who felt his honor and authority were being challenged. Frustrated, he left Antioch in a huff, forcing Eleanor to go with him to Jerusalem. Once in Jerusalem, King Baldwin III and the High Court gathered a war council at Acre with Louis, Conrad, and other crusade leaders. You'd think they would focus on securing Edessa or weakening Zangi's successor, Nur al-Din, but instead, they made a pretty questionable decision to attack Damascus. This choice was more about immediate concerns in Jerusalem rather than the broader goals of the crusade. Even though Damascus was under Muslim control, it had generally kept peaceful ties with the Crusader States, acting as a buffer against more aggressive Muslim forces. So this attack was risky. It could push Damascus right into Nur al-Din's arms, which is exactly what ended up happening. The siege of Damascus kicked off on July 24th, 1148, but it quickly spiraled into a mess. The Crusaders initially set up in the orchards to the west of the city, but then they made a major blunder by moving to the eastern side, where there was barely any water or supplies and no natural cover. Rumors of Nur al-Din's relief army closing in, along with suspicions of betrayal among the Crusader factions, led to the siege being called off after just 4 days. Talk about a humiliating retreat. This failure pretty much wrapped up the military phase of the Second Crusade. Conrad headed back to Germany in September 1148, while Louis stuck around in Jerusalem until spring 1149, achieving little more than visiting holy sites. When he finally made it back to France in November 1149, the Second Crusade had nothing significant to show for its efforts in the East. The failure of this expedition sparked a lot of blame and soul-searching across Europe. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had promised divine backing for the mission, faced a wave of criticism. He defended the crusade by likening the Crusaders to the Israelites from the Bible, claiming they were being tested by God through suffering, and blamed the poor outcome on the sins of the participants. This kind of theological spin would become a common way to explain crusading failures in future expeditions. But the Second Crusade wasn't just a military flop. It also had some serious long-term consequences. It highlighted the logistical headaches of moving large armies through Anatolia, especially without the support of the Byzantines. The lack of a clear strategy, especially with that ill-fated attack on Damascus, revealed the conflicting interests between the European Crusaders and the established Latin states in the East. For Muslim leaders like Nur al-Din, the failure of the crusade confirmed that unity and coordinated resistance were the way to go. With Damascus alienated by the Crusader attack, it gradually fell under Nur al-Din's influence, which only strengthened the anti-Crusader coalition. The Muslim world started to embrace the idea of jihad more openly as a response to the crusading rhetoric. In Europe, the Second Crusade's failure put a damper on enthusiasm for large-scale expeditions, but it didn't completely snuff out the crusading spirit. Future crusade planners would try to learn from the strategic and logistical mistakes made during this campaign. Meanwhile, the rise of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers helped the Crusader States bolster their defenses to deal with ongoing manpower shortages. The experience of the Second Crusade showed that the initial success of crusading was not something that could be easily repeated. As the 12th century moved on, both Christians and Muslims adjusted their strategies and ideologies for a long and drawn-out struggle over the Holy Land. The 4 decades after the Second Crusade saw a major shift in power in the Near East. While the Crusader states were busy dealing with internal squabbles and succession issues, the Muslim world came together like never before under an incredible leader, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or as we know him, Saladin. Born into a Kurdish military family in 1137, Saladin climbed the ranks through his service to Nur al-Din, the Turkish ruler who had brought Muslim territories together after the Second Crusade. When Nur al-Din passed away in 1174, Saladin seized the opportunity to take control of Damascus and eventually Cairo, uniting Syria and Egypt under his leadership. He did this with a mix of military skill, political savvy, and a strong sense of religious duty. Saladin founded the Ayyubid dynasty and positioned himself as the defender of Islam against the Crusader presence. Unlike many before him, Saladin tackled the conflict with the Latin states in a methodical way. He built up his economic and military strength, eliminated potential rivals among Muslims, and kept a close eye on the Crusader States for any signs of weakness. His reputation for fairness and commitment to Islamic law won him a lot of support, and his strategic mindset allowed him to focus on long-term goals rather than quick wins. On the flip side, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem was facing serious internal issues. King Baldwin IV, although a capable ruler, was battling leprosy, which gradually hindered his ability to govern and lead troops. Succession disputes became more intense, with factions rallying around different heirs and regents. The biggest divide was between the court party, led by Raymond III of Tripoli, who favored cautious coexistence with Muslims, and the aggressive war party, centered around Reynold of Chatillon and Guy of Lusignan. Reynold, the Lord of Altry Jordan, repeatedly broke truces with Saladin by attacking Muslim caravans and pilgrims, including a raid in 1183 that put the holy cities of Mecca and Medina at risk. These actions gave Saladin a legitimate reason for war and weakened the kingdom's diplomatic standing. Things came to a head in 1186 when Guy of Lusignan, married to Baldwin IV's sister Sibylla, claimed the throne after a series of deaths in the royal family. Raymond III refused to acknowledge Guy's kingship and kept a separate peace with Saladin. This division turned disastrous when Reynold provoked Saladin again in 1187 by attacking a large caravan despite a truce. Saladin demanded compensation, which Guy couldn't get from the stubborn Reynold. With a mix of religious justification and a political opportunity, Saladin declared the truce null and rallied the largest Muslim army the region had seen since the First Crusade. The crisis forced Guy and Raymond to reconcile, but even united, their army faced overwhelming odds. Ignoring Raymond's advice, Guy decided to march from the safety of Tiberias to confront Saladin's forces directly. This led to the pivotal battle at the Horns of Hattin on July 4, 1187. The Crusader army, suffering from heat and thirst after Saladin cut off their access to water, found itself trapped on the plateaus west of the Sea of Galilee. The battle was a slow, methodical dismantling of Crusader fighting strength. When it was over, nearly the entire military might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was either dead or captured. King Guy, Reynold, and most of the noble leaders fell into Saladin's hands, along with the kingdom's most sacred relic, a fragment of the true cross that had accompanied them into battle. Saladin executed Reynold for breaking his oaths and raiding Muslim pilgrims, but treated most other captives according to the chivalric standards of the time. The military orders faced particularly harsh treatment, as Saladin gave the Templar and Hospitaller Knights the choice of converting to Islam or facing death, and most chose the latter. With the kingdom's army in shambles, Saladin took a systematic approach to dismantle the remaining fortresses and cities. The ultimate prize, Jerusalem, fell on October 2, 1187, after a brief siege. Unlike the horrific bloodshed that followed the First Crusade's capture of the city, Saladin allowed for an orderly evacuation, letting most Christians ransom themselves and take their belongings. This generosity boosted his reputation and stood in stark contrast to the earlier behavior of the Christians. By the end of 1187, the Crusaders were left with just a few coastal strongholds, mainly Tyre, which was successfully defended by Conrad of Montferrat, a fresh European noble. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, which had been established with so much effort during the First Crusade, had effectively disappeared as a territorial reality. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through Europe. Pope Gregory VIII issued the bull Audita Tremendi, calling for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy City. The response from European monarchs was more robust than any crusade since the first. 3 of Western Europe's most powerful rulers took up the cross. Frederick I, Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor; Philip II, Augustus, King of France; and Richard I, the Lionheart, the newly crowned King of England. This unprecedented coalition of royal leaders earned the expedition its historical label as the King's Crusade. Frederick Barbarossa, nearly 70 years old, was the oldest and most experienced of the 3 monarchs. Having participated in the Second Crusade as a young man, he brought unmatched prestige and commanded the largest army, estimated at 100,000 men, including 20,000 knights. He set out in May 1189, choosing the land route through Hungary and Byzantine territory. Despite initial diplomatic hiccups with the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, Frederick's massive army moved efficiently through Anatolia, defeating Turkish forces at Iconium in May 1190. But then disaster struck. On June 10th, while crossing the Salif River in Cilicia, Frederick drowned under unclear circumstances. His death crushed German morale, and most of his army fell apart, with only a small fraction continuing to the Holy Land under his son Frederick of Swabia. The Anglo-French contingent took a different route. Wary of the dangers of the land path, Richard and Philip opted to transport their forces by sea. Their preparations were extensive, with both kings imposing special taxes, the Saladin tithe, to fund the expedition. They met in Vézelay in July 1190 to coordinate plans, then headed to Sicily, where they spent the winter waiting for favorable sailing conditions. However, the Sicily layover revealed underlying tensions between the 2 monarchs. Richard aggressively negotiated with the Sicilian ruler Tancred, eventually securing extra ships and supplies by force. Philip, more reserved and calculating, grew increasingly resentful of Richard's flamboyant leadership style and military reputation. Their uneasy alliance further soured when Richard formally broke off his long-standing betrothal to Philip's sister Alice, announcing his intention to marry Berengaria of Navarre instead. Richard's fleet finally set sail from Sicily in April 1191, but a storm scattered his ships. Several vessels wrecked on Cyprus, then ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a rogue Byzantine governor who imprisoned survivors and seized their property. Richard responded decisively, conquering the island in May 1191. This unexpected conquest proved strategically valuable, giving the Crusaders a secure supply base free from Muslim threats. Richard later sold Cyprus to the Templars, who then handed it over to Guy of Lusignan, establishing a new Latin kingdom that would endure long after the mainland Crusader States fell. Richard finally reached the siege of Acre in June 1191, joining forces already assembled under Philip and local Crusader leaders. The siege had begun in August 1189, becoming one of the longest and most complex military operations of the medieval period. The city's Muslim garrison resisted fiercely, while Saladin's field army harassed the besiegers from outside, creating a double challenge for the Crusader forces. Richard's arrival reinvigorated the siege operations. His military expertise, especially in siege warfare, sped up progress against Acre's defenses. The city surrendered on July 12, 1191, after negotiators agreed that the garrison could leave in exchange for 200,000 gold pieces, the release of Christian captives, and the return of the true cross. The aftermath of Acre's fall marked the beginning of the Crusades' disintegration as a unified effort. Philip Augustus, citing illness and political concerns about succession in France, left for home on July 31st, leaving Richard as the sole king in charge of the expedition. Although Philip left a substantial contingent under the Duke of Burgundy, his departure hurt Crusader morale and unity. Tensions escalated in August when the negotiated ransom payments from Acre fell behind schedule. Richard, frustrated with the delays, ordered the execution of around 2,700 Muslim prisoners from the Acre garrison, an act that shocked contemporaries on both sides and hardened Saladin's resolve. With Acre secured, Richard began his march south toward Jerusalem in August 1191. Saladin shadowed the Crusader army, avoiding direct confrontation until he could pick favorable terrain. On September 7th, near Arsuf, Saladin launched a major attack on the marching Crusader forces. Richard showcased his tactical brilliance, keeping a disciplined formation under repeated cavalry charges until the perfect moment, and unleashing a devastating counterattack that drove Saladin's forces from the field. The victory at Arsuf bolstered Richard's already formidable reputation and provided a temporary strategic advantage. The Crusader army continued south, eventually reaching Jaffa, which Richard fortified as a forward base. However, as autumn turned to winter, the campaign's momentum slowed. Richard fell ill, supply lines became stretched, and disagreements emerged among Crusader leaders about strategic priorities. The following months evolved into a strategic chess match between Richard and Saladin. Richard made two advances toward Jerusalem, reaching the village of Beit Nuba, just 12 miles from the Holy City in January 1192, and again in June 1192. Each time, concerns about logistics, weather, and the sustainability of any conquest forced a withdrawal. Between these advances, Richard focused on consolidating the coastal territories and rebuilding key fortresses, particularly Ashkelon in the south. He understood that without secure supply lines and defensible positions, any capture of Jerusalem would likely be short-lived. This practical approach conflicted with the expectations of the rank-and-file Crusaders, who were eager to reclaim the Holy City, creating tension within the Crusader camp. As 1192 rolled on, both Richard and Saladin felt the heat to negotiate. Richard was getting some worrying news about his brother John stirring things up back in England, and Philip Augustus eyeing his French lands. Meanwhile, Saladin was dealing with tired troops and some political pushback after years of fighting. Even though they never met face to face, they were able to communicate through intermediaries, building a kind of mutual respect despite being on opposite sides. By September 1192, after Richard pulled off a final show of military strength by relieving Jaffa, they struck the Treaty of Jaffa. This agreement set up a 3-year truce, confirmed Crusader control over the coastline from Tyre to Jaffa, and guaranteed that unarmed Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem freely. It wasn't everything the Crusade had aimed for, but it was a reflection of the reality on the ground. Jerusalem stayed under Muslim control, but the Crusaders had managed to save their presence in the Levant from near extinction after Hattin. The coastal territories would serve as the backbone of a reformed kingdom of Jerusalem, though it would be much smaller and less powerful than before. Richard packed up and left the Holy Land on October 9, 1192. His journey home turned into quite the adventure when storms forced his ship to land in enemy territory, ruled by Duke Leopold of Austria. Disguised, Richard was recognized and captured, eventually ending up in the hands of Emperor Henry VI, who demanded a hefty ransom for his freedom. After more than a year in captivity, he finally made it back to England in March 1194. Even though the Third Crusade didn't manage to take back Jerusalem, it still scored some significant military wins that kept the Latin Christian presence in the Holy Land alive for another century. This expedition showcased both the peak of medieval military power and the limitations of crusading as a strategy. Coordinating multinational forces, keeping supply lines running over long distances, and balancing different political goals with religious ideals all posed big challenges that held back the Crusades' effectiveness. For those watching from Europe, the Third Crusade sparked lasting cultural and historical tales. Richard's adventures became legendary, earning him the nickname Lionheart and a spot in the growing chivalric literature of the time. The strategic back and forth between Richard and Saladin, marked by a respect for each other as worthy opponents, set a standard for honorable conflict that would shape Western ideas of warfare for ages. In the Muslim world, Saladin's successful defense of Jerusalem, along with his fair treatment of enemies and strict adherence to Islamic principles, made him an ideal ruler in the eyes of many. His unification of Egypt and Syria under the Ayyubid dynasty changed the political game in the region. However, maintaining his achievements proved tricky for his successors after he passed away in March 1193, just months after Richard's departure. The Third Crusade was the peak of classic crusading warfare, featuring large-scale monarch-led missions aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem through direct military action. Future crusades would take different paths, learning from the King's Crusade and adapting to the changing political landscapes in both Europe and the Middle East. The Fourth Crusade is often seen as the most controversial of all the crusading missions. It started with the aim of reaching Jerusalem, but ended up with the shocking conquest and sack of Constantinople, which was the greatest Christian city of the medieval world. This dramatic shift from what was intended to what actually happened highlights the complicated mix of religious zeal, political strategy, economic interests, and sheer opportunism that marked the crusading movement by the early 13th century. The roots of the Fourth Crusade trace back to the ambitious vision of Pope Innocent III, who became Pope in 1198 at just 37 years old. He was incredibly smart and had a knack for administration, seeing the papacy as the top moral and political authority in Christendom. A new crusade was a key part of his grand plan to assert papal leadership and reform Christian society. In August 1198, he issued the bull Post Miserabile, calling for a new expedition to reclaim Jerusalem. Unlike earlier crusade appeals, this one laid out a detailed strategy that focused on Egypt as the critical first step. Innocent understood that Egypt was not only the economic heart of Muslim power, but also the most vulnerable route to the Holy Land. By taking Egypt first, the Crusaders could set up a strong base for their operations against Jerusalem and cut off resources to Muslim forces in Syria and Palestine. Recruitment for the crusade started off slowly until a tournament in Champagne in November 1199 sparked interest. Several prominent French nobles, including Count Thibaut of Champagne, Count Louis of Blois, and Count Baldwin of Flanders, decided to join the cause. Thibaut became the nominal leader of the expedition, but after his unexpected death in May 1201, leadership shifted to Boniface of Montferrat, an experienced Italian nobleman with ties to both the Byzantine Empire and the Crusader States. In a crucial early decision, the newly recruited Crusaders opted to travel by sea instead of attempting the tough land route through Anatolia. This smart choice led them to negotiate with Venice, the top maritime power in the Mediterranean, for a massive transport fleet. In March 1201, they struck a deal with the 85-year-old but still sharp Doge Enrico Dandolo. Venice agreed to build transport vessels for 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, provide 9 months of supplies, and contribute 50 war galleys, all for a hefty sum of 85,000 silver marks. The contract stated that payment was due when the Crusaders gathered in Venice in June 1202. However, things took a turn for the worse when only about 1/3 of the expected Crusader forces showed up on time. Many groups chose different embarkation points or dropped out altogether, leaving those who did arrive in Venice unable to pay. Despite selling off their assets, the assembled Crusaders still fell 34,000 marks short of the required payment. Venice, having shifted much of its resources to fulfill the contract, faced serious economic strain. This financial mess led to the first major deviation from the original plan. Doge Dandolo suggested a solution. The Crusaders could postpone payment by helping Venice reclaim Zara, a former Venetian city that had revolted and sought Hungarian protection. The Crusade leaders reluctantly agreed, despite the ethical issues of attacking a city that belonged to the King of Hungary, who had taken the Crusaders' vow. When Pope Innocent found out, he prohibited the attack and threatened excommunication for anyone who participated. Still, the combined Venetian Crusader force set sail from Venice in October 1202 and laid siege to Zara in November. After a brief resistance, the city fell, and the attackers spent the winter there while planning their next move. Innocent excommunicated the entire expedition, but later lifted the ban for the French Crusaders, keeping it in place only for the Venetians. This partial absolution allowed the crusade to continue, though it was under a cloud of ethical concerns. While at Zara, the crusade leaders received a proposal that would change their mission entirely. Envoys from Prince Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, arrived. Isaac had been overthrown and blinded in 1195 by his brother, Alexios III. The young Alexios, who had escaped to the west, promised substantial rewards if the Crusaders would help restore his father to the throne. He offered 200,000 silver marks, supplies for the entire army, a contingent of 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the Egyptian campaign, and the maintenance of 500 knights in the Holy Land. Most importantly, he pledged to heal the split between Eastern and Western Christianity by bringing the Greek Orthodox Church under papal authority. This offer really stirred things up among the Crusade leaders. Some folks, especially those from the Cistercian order, who were all about sticking to the original plan, were totally against any detours from the Egyptian strategy. On the flip side, you had Boniface of Montferrat and the Venetians, who thought that taking a side trip to Byzantium could actually boost their resources and help solve their ongoing money troubles. In the end, the Byzantine proposal won out, but it didn't come without more divisions within the crusade. A good chunk of the Crusaders, not wanting to attack fellow Christians in Constantinople, either headed straight for the Holy Land or just went back home. So the remaining forces set sail for Constantinople in April 1203, landing at the Byzantine capital on June 24th. Seriously, not many medieval cities could compete with the beauty and defenses of Constantinople. With its massive walls and the natural barrier of the Bosphorus, this city had held strong against countless sieges over its 9-century history. It boasted a population nearing 500,000, making it way bigger than any Western European city. Its churches, palaces, and monuments were packed with artistic and religious treasures built up over centuries of imperial rule. When the Crusaders first assessed the situation, they recognized the tough challenges ahead, but also spotted some weaknesses. Emperor Alexios III had really dropped the ball on military readiness, and the city's once mighty navy was in bad shape. Plus, his rise to power and the chaos that followed had left many people unhappy. On July 17, 1203, the Crusaders kicked off a big land and sea attack on the city. The Venetian fleet managed to break through the harbor chain and set up a beachhead near the Blascherny Palace, while the Crusader Knights clashed with Byzantine forces outside the city walls. Even though they couldn't break through the main defenses, the weak military response made Alexios III realize he was in deep trouble. Under the cover of night, he hightailed it out of the city with a bunch of treasury funds, leaving his people behind. The Byzantine court quickly put the blind Isaac II back on the throne and welcomed Prince Alexios, who was crowned Alexios IV, as co-emperor. The Crusaders seemed to have hit their immediate goal without actually taking the city. The reinstated emperors greeted the Western forces as allies and set up camp across the Golden Horn at Galata. But things quickly went south when it came to the promised rewards. The imperial treasury, drained by years of mismanagement and Alexios III's theft, couldn't cough up the agreed amount. Alexios IV only managed to pay part of it by seizing church property and slapping on special taxes moves that didn't sit well with the locals. The promise of a religious union with Rome sparked intense backlash from Orthodox clergy and everyday people who saw it as a betrayal of their beliefs. As the months dragged on and payments fell behind, tensions between the Crusaders and Byzantines grew. Alexios IV, stuck between the demands of the West and the anger of his own people, became more desperate. Then, in December 1203, a fire broke out during a riot between local citizens and Western soldiers, wiping out a large part of the city. This disaster only fueled anti-Latin feelings and further weakened Alexios IV's shaky hold on power. By January 1204, popular discontent culminated in revolution. A court official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortsouphlos for his prominent eyebrows, led a palace coup, imprisoning Alexios IV and reinstating imperial resistance to Crusader demands. Shortly thereafter, the young emperor was strangled and his blind father died, reportedly from shock. Mortsouphlos was crowned Emperor Alexios V and immediately adopted a confrontational stance, strengthening the city's defenses and ordering the Crusader camp bombarded. These events really changed the game for the Crusader leadership. With their supposed ally gone and the new regime openly hostile, they had some tough choices to make. Either retreat in failure, push on to Egypt with dwindling resources, or try to take Constantinople by force. The combination of economic necessity, a feeling of betrayal, and the lure of incredible riches pushed them toward their third option. To make this drastic move legit, the Crusaders and Venetians put together a treaty in March 1204 that laid out how to divide the spoils and run the conquered city. This agreement even included plans for picking a Latin emperor, with the Venetians calling the shots on who got to be the patriarch. The Crusade leaders also wanted a theological excuse for their actions, labeling the Byzantines as traitors to Christendom who had killed their rightful ruler and turned their backs on church unity. On April 9, 1204, the Crusaders kicked off their attack on Constantinople's sea walls. The first attempt didn't go well, as the Byzantine defenders held their ground. With supplies running low and disaster looming, the Crusaders regrouped for one last push on April 12th. This time, luck was on their side with favorable winds, helping the Venetian ships get close to the walls, allowing their specially built bridges to work effectively. A few small groups of Crusaders managed to secure footholds on the walls and opened the gates from the inside. By the afternoon of April 12th, the fate of the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was sealed. Emperor Alexios V fled, and on April 13th, the Crusaders marched into Constantinople as conquerors, not allies. What followed was 3 days of chaos, looting, destruction, and violence that shocked even the toughest medieval folks. The Venetians mainly focused on grabbing portable wealth and valuable artifacts, especially the 4 bronze horses that would later sit atop San Marco Cathedral. Meanwhile, the Crusader knights and foot soldiers went on a rampage of destruction and desecration. Churches were stripped of relics, gold, and other treasures. Sacred vessels were turned into drinking cups. Nuns faced terrible violations in their convents. The magnificent Hagia Sophia, the largest and most revered church in Christendom for 7 centuries, saw its altar smashed, its silver iconostasis melted down, and its sacred spaces turned into places of debauchery. Even the Crusader chronicles couldn't ignore the sheer scale of the atrocities. Geoffrey de Villard-Douan, who took part in the crusade and later wrote about it, admitted that never since the world was created had so much booty been won in any city. Another crusader, Robert de Clary, estimated that the plunder was greater than all the wealth in Western Europe combined. Beyond the material losses, the sack led to a huge cultural loss. Countless ancient manuscripts, artworks, and historical records were destroyed in fires or through sheer wantonness. While some treasures made their way to Venice and other Western cities, sparking a Renaissance interest in classical knowledge, many more simply vanished forever. After the conquest, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, with Baldwin of Flanders elected as emperor on May 16, 1204. Byzantine territories were split among the victors according to the March Agreement, creating a patchwork of Crusader states, Venetian colonies, and Byzantine successor kingdoms in exile. But this Latin empire didn't last long and was pretty unstable. It faced constant military pressure from Bulgarian forces and Byzantine resistance groups based in Nicaea and Epirus, gradually losing territory and legitimacy. By 1261, forces from the Nicaean Empire under Michael VIII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople, ending the Latin occupation and restoring a diminished Byzantine state that would hang on until the Ottoman conquest of 1453. Pope Innocent III's reaction to the fall of Constantinople showed the moral complexity of the Fourth Crusade. At first, he was thrilled about the chance to end the East-West schism through the new Latin Patriarch. But as reports of the atrocities reached Rome, his view changed dramatically. In letters to the Crusade leaders, he condemned the attack on fellow Christians and the horrific excesses that came with the conquest. How indeed is the Greek Church to be brought back into ecclesiastical union and to a devotion for the Apostolic See when she has been beset with so many afflictions and persecutions that she sees in the Latins only an example of perdition and the works of darkness, so that she now, and with reason, detests the Latins more than dogs? Despite this condemnation, Innocent recognized the political reality of the Latin Empire's existence and worked to solidify papal authority over it. This pragmatic approach illustrates the competing pressures facing the medieval papacy, keeping moral authority while pushing for institutional interests. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade was profound and lasting for Eastern Christians. The sack of Constantinople confirmed their worst fears about Western intentions and became a defining trauma in Orthodox historical memory. Instead of healing the theological divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, as Prince Alexios had promised, it deepened into a chasm that still exists today. When Byzantine emperors later faced threats from the Ottoman Turks in the 14th and 15th centuries, many Orthodox subjects felt they'd rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople than the Pope's tiara. For Western Europe, the Crusade was both a triumph and a moral failure. The conquest of Christendom's greatest city showcased Latin military strength, but it undermined the crusading ideal as a holy mission. Future expeditions struggled to regain the moral clarity and religious fervor of earlier efforts. The material and cultural fallout echoed for centuries. Venice emerged as the main beneficiary, using its new trade monopolies and territories to accelerate its rise as the dominant commercial power in the Mediterranean. The massive transfer of wealth, religious relics, and artistic treasures from east to west changed the cultural landscape of Europe, especially in Italy, where Byzantine influences helped spark the early stages of Renaissance art and scholarship. Most importantly, the Crusade shifted Mediterranean power dynamics at a crucial historical moment. The weakening of Byzantium as a buffer between Europe and the Islamic world created a power vacuum that would eventually be filled by the rising Ottoman state. The bitter memory of Latin betrayal hindered potential Christian cooperation against this emerging threat, indirectly paving the way for the eventual Ottoman conquest of Constantinople and southeastern Europe. The Fourth Crusade stands as a watershed moment in medieval history. It was a time when the internal contradictions of the crusading movement became glaringly obvious, when religious idealism crashed into political and economic realities, and when the complex relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity was forever changed. What started as a mission to reclaim Jerusalem ended up altering the course of European and Mediterranean history in ways none of its participants could have ever imagined. The Fourth Crusade ended in a real mess, leaving the whole crusading movement in shambles. Sure, the conquest of Constantinople boosted Western Europe's presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, but it also completely wrecked the moral authority of crusading. Pope Innocent III, who was initially super excited about the Crusades, found himself in a tough spot. Instead of the original goal of reclaiming Jerusalem, he was watching Christian warriors attack fellow Christians. Not exactly what he had in mind, right? Wanting to get things back on track, Innocent called for the Fourth Lateran Council in November 1215. This was a big deal. Over 400 bishops, 800 abbots, and a bunch of secular rulers came together to tackle church reform, heresy, and the mission to recover the Holy Land. It was Innocent's way of trying to breathe new life into the crusading spirit and steer Western military efforts back toward genuine religious goals. The council rolled out a decree called Ad Liberandum, which laid out a solid game plan based on lessons learned from past expeditions. Innocent kept the focus on Egypt, which he saw as a key player in the Ayyubid power structure. To fund this venture, he imposed a 3-year church tax, banned trade with Muslim territories, and set up multiple departure points to avoid the logistical mess that had derailed the last crusade. The most important change? The council decided that the Pope would have direct oversight of the entire operation. No more handing the reins over to secular leaders with their own agendas. The Pope would appoint a papal legate to take charge, ensuring that religious goals stayed front and center instead of getting lost in political squabbles. Sadly, Innocent didn't get to see his plans come to life. He passed away in July 1216, leaving his successor, Honorius III, to carry out the carefully laid out crusade plan. At first, they tried to rally the kings of Europe, but it didn't go too well. Philip II of France was hesitant, still remembering the troubles his father faced during the Second Crusade. Meanwhile, the young Henry III of England was too wrapped up in his own issues to join in. Emperor Frederick II of Germany took the cross, but kept pushing back his departure, citing pressing matters in his various territories. Leadership eventually fell to some lesser but still notable nobles. King Andrew II of Hungary, Duke Leopold VI of Austria, and John of Brienne, who was the titular king of Jerusalem, ruling over the small state based in Acre. These guys were committed to the crusading cause, but they didn't have the resources or clout of the kings who led the Third Crusade. King Andrew's contingent was the first to arrive in the Holy Land in the fall of 1217. However, his style of crusading didn't sit well with local leaders. Instead of working towards coordinated military goals, Andrew seemed more interested in collecting relics and making pilgrimages to holy sites. After a few lackluster skirmishes with Muslim forces, he declared his mission accomplished and headed back to Hungary in January 1218, taking a bunch of his knights with him. This rocky start gave way to stronger leadership under Leopold of Austria and John of Brienne. With reinforcements from Germany, Italy, France, and England, they set out to follow the Egyptian strategy laid out by the Lateran Council. In May 1218, the Crusader army landed near Damietta, a fortified port city that was crucial for controlling access to the Nile Delta. Damietta was the perfect strategic target. Positioned on the eastern branch of the Nile, it was both a major trading hub and a key defensive position guarding the route to Cairo. Capturing it would give the Crusaders a solid base to push further into Egypt, and might even force Sultan al-Kamil, Saladin's brother, to negotiate the return of Jerusalem. The initial phase of the siege centered on a massive chain tower in the Nile that protected the harbor. After several failed attempts to take it, Crusader engineers came up with a clever floating siege platform. Two ships tied together with a scaling ladder. This setup allowed for a bold attack in August 1218, leading to the capture of the tower and breaking the city's river defenses. But even with this win, the main city held strong. The Crusaders set up a fortified camp and braced themselves for a long siege. Conditions were tough for both sides. The Crusader camp struggled with the harsh Egyptian climate, new diseases, and occasional flooding. Inside Damietta, things got desperate as the population faced dwindling supplies and rising casualties. The long siege gave time for significant reinforcements to reach the Crusader camp. Cardinal Pelagius of Albano showed up in September 1218 as the papal legate appointed by Honorius III. His arrival changed the command structure and decision-making for the expedition. Claiming the authority given by the Lateran Council, Pelagius took charge, sidelining John of Brienne's military leadership, which created tensions that would ultimately hurt the Crusade's effectiveness. A notable figure during the siege was Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order. Hoping to stop the bloodshed and convert Muslims to Christianity, Francis crossed the battle lines in September 1219 to meet with Sultan al-Kamil. While the details of their chat are a bit fuzzy, sources from the time say the Sultan treated Francis with respect and even let him preach before safely sending him back to the Crusader camp. This remarkable moment showed that there were other ways to interact across cultures, even during such a military-heavy time. After 18 months of siege, Damietta finally fell to the Crusaders in November 1219. Starvation and disease had decimated the city's population from around 60,000 to fewer than 10,000. When the Crusaders entered, they found streets strewn with unburied bodies and hardly any survivors left to resist. The conquest, achieved through persistence rather than direct assault, handed the Crusaders a nearly intact city with valuable infrastructure and defenses. The fall of Damietta marked the peak of the Fifth Crusade. With this key Egyptian port under their control, the Crusaders had successfully executed a strategic plan that had eluded the Fourth Crusade. Sultan al-Kamil, realizing the threat to his capital in Cairo, offered incredibly favorable terms. He would fully restore the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the Holy City itself, in exchange for the Crusaders pulling out of Egypt. This extraordinary offer, which could achieve what 4 previous crusades had failed to do without bloodshed, sparked deep disagreements among the Crusader leadership. King John of Brienne, along with the military orders and many secular nobles, leaned towards accepting the offer. They recognized the practical challenges of holding territory in Egypt versus the real chance of re-establishing the Christian kingdom in its traditional heartland. Cardinal Pelagius, however, turned down the proposal. With more reinforcements arriving from Europe, he believed total victory in Egypt was still possible. Some historians suggest he thought the Sultan's offer was a trap to get rid of the Crusader threat before going back on his word about Jerusalem. Others think Pelagius's papal instructions emphasized complete victory over a negotiated settlement. Whatever his reasons, Pelagius's rejection of al-Kamil's offer stands out as one of the crusading movement's biggest diplomatic blunders. Jerusalem, the recovery of which was the movement's main goal, was within reach through negotiation. Yet the chance slipped away due to internal disputes and strategic miscalculations. The Crusader army stayed in Damietta for almost a year after capturing it, enjoying the city's comforts while debating their next steps. This delay proved disastrous. It allowed al-Kamil to fortify Cairo's defenses, rebuild his military, and reconcile with his brothers, al-Muazzam of Damascus and al-Ashraf of the Jazeera, forming a united Muslim front against the invaders. In July 1221, bolstered by troops under Duke Louis of Bavaria, and believing Frederick II's long-promised arrival was near, Pelagius overruled ongoing objections from King John and ordered an advance toward Cairo. The Crusader army, numbering around 15,000 to 20,000 fighting men, followed the Nile's eastern branch southward. They captured the fortress of Sharamsa and continued to the fork in the Nile and Manshura, where the Damietta branch meets the main river. By August, the Crusaders set up camp near Al-Adilia, southwest of Manshura. Their position, while seeming good, had a critical flaw. It was low ground between the Nile and its canals in an area prone to flooding. Sultan al-Kamil, familiar with Egypt's geography and climate, saw this weakness. As the Crusaders prepared for a final push on Cairo, the Sultan ordered the Nile dams to be broken. Water levels quickly rose around the Crusader camp, trapping the army on ever-shrinking patches of dry land. At the same time, the Egyptian fleet controlled the river, cutting off any chance of retreat to Damietta. The Crusader position shifted from offensive to desperate in no time. With supplies running low and no chance to advance or retreat effectively, Pelagius had no choice but to negotiate from a position of extreme weakness. The resulting treaty required the complete evacuation of Egypt by the Crusaders, including abandoning Damietta in exchange for an 8-year truce and the return of a supposed fragment of the True Cross. The Crusaders also had to release all prisoners without getting their own captives back. On September 8, 1221, the remnants of the Crusader army marched out of Egypt, having turned a position of significant advantage into a total defeat. The Fifth Crusade, despite its promising start and the capture of a major strategic target, ultimately failed to reclaim any territory in the Holy Land or meaningfully improve the Christian position in the Eastern Mediterranean. This outcome had serious implications for the crusading movement. The strategic idea of focusing on Egypt had been sound. Capturing Damietta had indeed forced Al-Kamil to offer Jerusalem. However, the execution failed due to divided leadership, delayed decision-making, and poor tactical choices in the final campaign. The Lateran Council's model of direct papal control through a legate didn't yield better leadership than previous arrangements under secular authority. Debate over who was to blame for the failure heated up at the time. Supporters of Pelagius pointed fingers at John of Brienne's reluctance and the absence of Frederick II, whose promised forces might have changed the game. John's supporters highlighted Pelagius's rejection of favorable peace terms and his lack of military experience. Modern historians generally agree that multiple factors contributed to the failure: the divided command structure, strategic delays after capturing Damietta, and fundamental miscalculations about Egyptian geography and climate. For the papacy, the Fifth Crusade represented a major investment of institutional prestige and resources with disappointing results. The thorough planning process set up by the Lateran Council had successfully launched the expedition, but failed to guarantee effective field leadership or strategic decision-making. Future crusades would continue to struggle with the inherent tension between papal authority and practical military leadership. One of the biggest outcomes of the failed crusade was the further development of the military orders, especially the Templars and Hospitallers, as the main defenders of Christian interests in the Holy Land. These organizations, with their permanent presence and specialized experience, increasingly took charge of strategic planning and defensive operations between major crusades. For European observers, the Fifth Crusade reinforced growing doubts about the practical achievability of crusading goals. The movement had now seen 5 major expeditions, with only the first achieving substantial lasting territorial gains. This pattern of diminishing returns led to evolving ideas about crusading that emphasized different approaches: diplomatic engagement, targeted expeditions, or focusing on other geographic areas like the Baltic or Iberian Peninsula. The Muslim world, particularly the Ayyubid dynasty under Al-Kamil, showed both military resilience and diplomatic savvy during the conflict. After repelling the invasion, Al-Kamil continued to engage diplomatically with Western powers, realizing that negotiation often served his interests better than prolonged warfare. This pragmatic approach would shape his later dealings with Frederick II during the Sixth Crusade, leading to outcomes that military confrontation had repeatedly failed to achieve. The Sixth Crusade is one of the most unique chapters in crusading history. It's fascinating how this campaign achieved what 5 earlier attempts failed to do, all through diplomacy instead of warfare. At the heart of it was Emperor Frederick II Hohenstaufen, who used unconventional methods to secure results that traditional military strategies couldn't. This unexpected success stirred up as much debate as it did celebration, highlighting the intricate mix of religion, politics, and personal dynamics that defined the later crusading era. Frederick II stands out as one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval times. He became King of Sicily at just 3 years old, King of Germany by 18, and Holy Roman Emperor by 26, overseeing lands from the Baltic to Sicily. Growing up in Palermo's diverse culture, he developed a keen interest in science, philosophy, languages, and governance, earning the nickname Stupor Mundi, or the Wonder of the World. Frederick's connection to the crusading movement kicked off at his coronation in 1220, when he took a formal vow before Pope Honorius III. This vow took on extra weight after his marriage to Isabella II of Jerusalem in 1225, making him the titular King of Jerusalem and personally invested in reclaiming the Holy City. Yet, despite these motivations, Frederick kept delaying his departure, citing instability in his territories and conflicts with the Lombard cities in northern Italy. Pope Honorius was patient with these delays, but his successor, Gregory IX, wasn't so forgiving. When Frederick postponed his departure again in 1227 due to illness, Gregory excommunicated him, creating a rare scenario where an excommunicated emperor was leading a papal crusade. Still determined to honor his vow despite the church's censure, Frederick set off for the east in June 1228 with a small force of around 800 knights and 10,000 infantry. When Frederick arrived in the Levant, the political landscape turned out to be surprisingly favorable for diplomatic efforts. Sultan al-Kamil, who had defeated the Fifth Crusade, was facing significant challenges to his authority in the divided Ayyubid territories. His brother al-Muazzam of Damascus had died in 1227, sparking a succession crisis in Syria. Al-Kamil was backing his nephew en-Nasr Dawd against another brother, al-Ashraf, in a complex power struggle that made a Western alliance appealing for a moment. Frederick had built diplomatic ties with al-Kamil years before, sharing gifts and diving into philosophical chats through envoys. His approach was a true reflection of his diverse upbringing and love for learning. Unlike many Western rulers, Frederick welcomed Muslim scholars at his court, spoke Arabic, and genuinely appreciated Islamic culture. While some Europeans viewed these traits with suspicion, they uniquely positioned him for effective cross-cultural negotiations. When Frederick arrived in Acre in September 1228, the reception was anything but straightforward. As an excommunicated ruler, he couldn't expect the usual obedience from the military orders or the church hierarchy. The Templars and Hospitallers were there, but they weren't exactly eager to cooperate, refusing to join forces for military operations. Patriarch Gerald of Jerusalem was completely against Frederick's presence, seeing him as a dangerous usurper of both imperial and royal authority. Despite this rocky welcome, Frederick jumped right into negotiations with al-Kamil. The details of their talks aren't fully documented, but both leaders saw the potential benefits of reaching a peaceful agreement. Frederick needed a significant win to restore his reputation in Europe, while al-Kamil was keen on solidifying his position against rival family members. After 5 months of intense negotiations, Frederick and al-Kamil reached the Treaty of Jaffa on February 18, 1229. This treaty accomplished what generations of crusaders had fought and died for: Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, along with a corridor to the coast, would be back in Christian hands. Muslims would keep their religious rites at the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, two of the holiest sites in Islam located on the Temple Mount. Both sides agreed to a 10-year truce, with Frederick promising to defend Al-Kamil against any enemies, including potential Christian attackers. This diplomatic win sparked mixed reactions. Supporters of Frederick celebrated the treaty as proof of his innovative approach. He had managed to recover Christianity's holiest sites without shedding blood, showcasing a pragmatic wisdom that his predecessors lacked. On the flip side, critics saw the treaty as an unacceptable compromise with religious foes, especially since it allowed continued Muslim worship in Jerusalem. Frederick's entry into Jerusalem highlighted these contradictions. On March 17, 1229, he entered the Holy City as its Christian ruler, a moment of triumph that fulfilled the main goal of the entire crusading movement. Yet no clergy would perform religious ceremonies because of his excommunication. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Frederick reportedly crowned himself as the King of Jerusalem, since no religious authority would crown an excommunicated emperor. During his short stay in Jerusalem, Frederick showcased the intellectual curiosity and respect for other cultures that defined his reign. He engaged Muslim scholars in philosophical discussions, admired Islamic architectural features, and assured Muslim religious leaders that he would respect the treaty's provisions regarding their holy sites. While these actions reflected Frederick's cosmopolitan outlook, they further scandalized conservative religious figures in the West. The contradictions of Frederick's crusade reached a peak when he learned that papal forces had invaded his Italian territories while he was away. Gregory IX, not satisfied with just excommunicating Frederick, declared a crusade against the emperor's lands. This created a bizarre situation where crusaders were fighting in Italy while the Holy City was being peacefully recovered in Palestine. As a result, Frederick had to cut his stay in the East short, leaving in May 1229 after barely 2 months in his reclaimed kingdom. Before his departure, Frederick set up governance structures for the territories he had recovered, appointing Balian of Sidon as his representative. He also ordered the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, understanding that his diplomatic success needed physical defense to last. These practical steps reflected Frederick's pragmatic style of kingship, focusing on effective administration over strict ideological purity. Once back in Italy, Frederick swiftly defeated the papal forces and secured his territories. His military triumph, paired with the undeniable achievement of recovering Jerusalem, bolstered his negotiating power with Gregory IX. In 1230, the Treaty of San Germano reconciled the emperor and the pope, lifting Frederick's excommunication and temporarily resolving their conflict. While future disagreements would reignite the struggle between imperial and papal authority, Frederick proved he could pursue independent policies while maintaining crucial relationships with the Church. The territories reclaimed through the Sixth Crusade remained under Christian control for 15 years, which was longer than many expected given the limited military resources backing the diplomatic agreement. The Muslim world, especially conservative factions, criticized Al-Kamil for giving up Jerusalem. However, the treaty's implementation went relatively smoothly, allowing pilgrims to visit holy sites under reasonable security. In 1239, after Al-Kamil's death, the treaty began to fall apart. An-Nasir Dawd, the ousted ruler of Damascus, took control of areas around Jerusalem, blatantly violating the agreement. Western forces led by Theobald IV of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall launched limited expeditions, sometimes referred to as the Barons' Crusades, trying to enforce or renegotiate the treaty terms. While these efforts achieved temporary diplomatic extensions, they ultimately failed to establish lasting Christian control. Things took a turn for the worse in 1244 when Khwarezmian mercenaries, Turkish warriors displaced by the Mongol invasions, captured Jerusalem. They slaughtered its Christian population and desecrated holy sites. This catastrophe underscored the fundamental weakness of diplomatic arrangements that lacked adequate military backing. The Holy City would remain under Muslim control until the 20th century, making Frederick's achievement impressive but ultimately fleeting. The legacy of the Sixth Crusade is complex and contested. Frederick's diplomatic approach opened up possibilities for interreligious accommodation that traditional crusading ideology had largely ignored. His willingness to negotiate with Muslim rulers, respect their religious beliefs, and seek mutually beneficial arrangements marked a significant shift in Western engagement with the Islamic world. At the same time, Frederick's methods challenged core assumptions about the purposes and procedures of crusading. The movement had been seen as a form of armed pilgrimage and holy warfare, activities rooted in deep religious antagonism. Frederick's pragmatic diplomacy, respect for Islamic culture, and openness to allowing Muslim worship in Jerusalem all contradicted these foundational concepts, hinting at alternative ways for East-West interactions. For the papacy, the Sixth Crusade posed a serious challenge to its authority. An excommunicated emperor had achieved what papal armies could not, undermining claims that divine favor always accompanied papal leadership. Gregory IX's declaration of a crusade against Frederick's territories, while the emperor peacefully reclaimed Jerusalem, highlighted the increasingly political nature of crusading mechanisms, a shift that would further diminish the movement's religious credibility. The broader crusading movement never fully reconciled the contradictions exposed by Frederick's expedition. Subsequent crusades continued to pursue traditional military strategies against Islamic powers, largely ignoring the diplomatic alternatives Frederick had shown were possible. This return to conventional methods reflected genuine religious conviction about the spiritual purposes of crusading, but it also indicated the limited applicability of Frederick's unique qualities and circumstances to broader East-West relations. One of the most interesting things about the Sixth Crusade is how it showed that Jerusalem, the emotional and spiritual center of the crusading movement, could be reclaimed without resorting to outright conquest. This achievement, even if it was short-lived, hinted that religious goals could be reached through practical engagement instead of just fighting. Although this idea wasn't really picked up in medieval Christian practices, it offered a fresh perspective on how different cultures could interact during a time when religious wars were the norm. Frederick II never made it back to the East. Instead, he focused on managing his complicated European territories and dealing with various popes. His crusading success, celebrated by some, got overshadowed by his ongoing battles with papal authority. By the time he passed away in 1250, the Christian presence in Jerusalem had already crumbled due to the Khwarezmian attack, and the Crusader States were under increasing pressure from rising Muslim powers. So, the Sixth Crusade stands out as a unique moment in crusading history. It was led by an excommunicated emperor who managed to achieve what armies couldn't through diplomacy. Yet, like many victories in war, this one was also fleeting, highlighting both the potential and the challenges of cross-cultural engagement in a medieval Mediterranean world. The violent recapture of Jerusalem by the Khwarezmian Turks in 1244 sent shockwaves through Western Christendom. Just 15 years earlier, Frederick II had diplomatically regained the Holy City, but now it was lost again, with Christian inhabitants massacred and holy sites desecrated. To make matters worse, Christian forces faced a crushing defeat at La Fourbe, Near Gaza, in October 1244, where an alliance of Crusader States and Damascus Muslims was routed by the combined Egyptian and Khwarezmian armies. As this news spread across Europe, the papacy was already grappling with conflicts against Emperor Frederick II. Pope Innocent IV, who had declared Frederick deposed at the Council of Lyon in 1245, was fighting for his political survival against imperial forces. Yet he recognized the urgent need to respond to the Jerusalem crisis and issued bulls calling for a new crusade. Unfortunately, the response from European royalty was pretty limited. Most monarchs were tied up with their own conflicts or internal issues, leaving little room for Eastern adventures. The crusading call found a champion in Louis IX of France, later known as Saint Louis. Born in 1214 and crowned at just 12 years old, Louis quickly made a name for himself as a ruler with exceptional piety, administrative skills, and moral authority. His deep personal faith was evident in practices that were pretty unusual for medieval kings. He attended multiple masses daily, practiced severe self-mortification, and personally cared for lepers. While these actions might seem extreme today, they showcased his genuine spiritual commitment, earning him respect from his contemporaries. Louis's decision to take up the crusade came after a near-death experience during a serious illness in 1244. After losing consciousness, he vowed to embark on a crusade if he recovered. When he heard about Jerusalem's fall shortly after, he took it as a divine sign to follow through on his vow. Despite objections from his mother, Blanche of Castile, and many advisors, Louis remained determined to go on the expedition. Preparation for the Seventh Crusade really showcased Louis's talent for administration and his attention to detail. Unlike those previous rushed expeditions, Louis took his time 4 whole years to get everything sorted out, from logistics to finances and diplomacy. He even introduced some hefty taxes across France, including a groundbreaking levy on church revenues. Sure, that stirred up quite a bit of pushback, but it also brought in the cash needed for ongoing operations. Louis wasn't just about raising funds. He was also focused on securing safe passage and finding potential allies. He chatted with Emperor Frederick II about transit rights in the Mediterranean, sent envoys to various Mongol leaders to explore partnerships against Muslim powers, and boosted French naval strength through deals with Genoa and Marseille. All of this showed he understood that previous crusades stumbled partly due to poor logistical planning. The expedition kicked off from Aigues-Mortes in southern France on August 25, 1248. Louis gathered around 15,000 men, including 2,500 knights, all set to sail on a fleet of 36 ships. Their first stop? Cyprus, which Frederick II had set up as a staging area during the Sixth Crusade. There, they spent the winter stocking up on supplies and waiting for reinforcements. During their 8-month stay in Cyprus, Louis held extensive strategy talks. Learning from the Fifth Crusade, he decided to hit Egypt first, knowing it was key to Ayyubid power. Damietta was the prime target because of its strategic location, controlling access to the Nile Delta and the route to Cairo. On May 13, 1249, the Crusader fleet set sail from Cyprus and landed near Damietta on June 4th. They faced immediate resistance from Ayyubid forces on the shore. In a bold move, Louis jumped from his ship into chest-high water, leading his knights ashore under enemy fire. His bravery inspired the French troops, who managed to establish a beachhead and push the Egyptian defenders back. To everyone's surprise, the Egyptians quickly abandoned Damietta the next day, retreating toward Cairo without destroying the city's supplies or infrastructure. This unexpected turn of events felt like a stroke of luck, allowing Louis to occupy the city, set up proper administration, and prepare for the march toward Cairo. At this crucial moment, Louis made a significant choice to wait for his brother Alphonse of Poitiers to arrive with more troops before moving forward. This delay, stretching from June to November 1249, cost them precious momentum and allowed the Egyptians to bolster their defenses. The Crusaders found themselves repeating the same mistake from the Fifth Crusade, giving their opponents valuable time to prepare while the conditions worsened with the impending Nile flood season. Meanwhile, the political landscape in Egypt was shifting dramatically. Sultan Az-Salih Ayyub passed away in November 1249, leading to a potential succession crisis. His capable wife, Shahjad al-Dur, kept his death under wraps until their son Turanshah could return from Mesopotamia to take the throne. This transition happened without the internal strife the Crusaders might have exploited, showcasing the Egyptian state's strong administrative structure. Finally, on November 20th, 1249, Alphonse of Poitiers arrived, and the Crusader army began its march toward Cairo. They moved along the Damietta branch of the Nile, aiming for Mansoura, the same place that had been a disaster for the Fifth Crusade. By December, they reached the point where the Nile meets the Bahr al-Sagir Canal, right across from Mansoura. Here, they hit their first major hurdle. The Egyptian army had set up defensive positions on the southern bank, blocking their crossing. For almost 2 months, the Crusaders tried various engineering tricks to bridge the water barrier, including building a causeway into the river. But the Egyptian forces systematically destroyed these efforts with projectile weapons, Greek fire, and targeted raids. The deadlock continued until a local Coptic Christian revealed a spot where the Bahr al-Sagir could be crossed several miles downstream. On February 8, 1250, Louis sent his brother, Robert of Artois, along with the Templars and select knights, to secure this crossing and set up a bridgehead. After successfully crossing the canal, Robert ignored clear orders to wait for the main army. Overconfident from their initial success, he charged straight into Mansoura. The Crusader vanguard briefly entered the city, causing panic among the Egyptian forces. But this advantage quickly turned into a disaster. The narrow streets of Mansoura made it hard for the cavalry to maneuver, while Egyptian troops, led by the Mamluk commander Baybars, rallied and counterattacked. Robert and nearly all of his advanced force were surrounded and killed, including hundreds of Templars and English knights under William Longespee. This devastating loss of elite heavy cavalry significantly weakened the Crusaders' offensive capabilities. When Louis arrived with the main army, he found his vanguard decimated, but managed to set up a defensive position outside Mansoura. For the next 2 months, both sides engaged in a grueling war of attrition, marked by Egyptian assaults and Crusader counterattacks. The French initially kept their discipline and supplies in check, but their situation worsened as Egyptian control of the river cut off reinforcements and resupply from Damietta. By late March, the Crusader camp faced dire food shortages. Poor nutrition and sanitation led to a severe outbreak of scurvy and dysentery. Accounts from that time describe horrific scenes: soldiers with blackened gums unable to eat, open sores covering their bodies, and mass deaths overwhelming burial efforts. Louis himself fell ill but refused to leave, insisting on staying with his men. As April 1250 rolled in, the military situation became unbearable. Louis ordered a general retreat toward Damietta on April 5th, but Egyptian forces quickly surrounded the withdrawing army near Farisker. The Crusaders suffered a crushing defeat. Louis, too weak from illness to ride, was captured along with his surviving brothers and most of the French nobility. Most common soldiers were executed, with only those who had special skills or ransom value spared. Louis's capture posed unprecedented diplomatic challenges. Never before had a reigning European monarch been taken prisoner by Muslim forces. The French king displayed remarkable composure during his captivity, maintaining his dignity while negotiating realistic terms. After several weeks of complicated discussions, a ransom agreement was reached. Louis would surrender Damietta and pay 400,000 livres tournois, around 30 tons of silver, for his release and that of his nobles. The end of the Egyptian campaign mirrored the Fifth Crusade's outcome, a complete withdrawal from Egypt without any territorial gains. However, it carried more symbolic weight due to the capture of a monarch who represented Western kingship. For the Muslim world, especially Egypt, this victory boosted their prestige and showed their ability to fend off Western invasions despite internal political upheaval. Upon his release, Louis faced a tough choice. Most prisoners would have rushed back to Europe after such a defeat, but he took a different route. Instead of abandoning the crusade, he headed to Acre, the capital of the remaining Kingdom of Jerusalem. This decision reflected both his religious commitment to his unfulfilled crusading vow and concern for Christian captives still held in Egypt. Louis stayed in the Holy Land for 4 years, an unprecedented commitment for a European king. During this time, he focused on strengthening the Crusader States' defenses rather than launching more offensive campaigns. His efforts included: Louis kicked off some major refortification projects at key coastal cities like Acre, Caesarea, Jaffa, and Sidon. He didn't just sit back and watch. He rolled up his sleeves and got involved in the construction, even carrying building materials alongside everyday workers as a show of humility and faith. On the diplomatic front, he was busy too. Louis reached out to various regional powers, exchanging embassies with the Mongols, receiving delegations from the Assassins, and negotiating with leaders in Damascus and Cairo to arrange prisoner exchanges and improve access for pilgrims. He also made some solid judicial and administrative reforms within the Crusader States, using his governance experience from France to strengthen institutions that had been weakened by years of military pressure. Plus, he provided financial support for military orders and local baronial forces to help maintain their defensive capabilities even after he left. These practical measures really helped extend the lifespan of the Crusader States, giving them the infrastructure and organization they needed to hold off Muslim pressure for several more decades. Louis's presence also put a temporary stop to the internal conflicts that had been undermining the effectiveness of the Crusader States for so long. However, by 1254, Louis's choice to stay in the East became harder to maintain. He got the news that his mother, Blanche of Castile, who had been acting as regent while he was away, had passed away in November 1252. Without her steady hand, France needed its king back to keep things running smoothly. So Louis reluctantly left Acre on April 24, 1254, having extended his crusade longer than any previous royal expedition. When he returned to France, Louis wasted no time in implementing domestic reforms, influenced by what he learned during his time in the Crusades. especially in judicial procedures and administrative structures. He kept in touch with the authorities in Acre and continued to provide financial support for ongoing defensive needs. Despite the military defeat, his personal reputation remained remarkably intact. People at the time attributed the failure of the expedition to divine testing rather than any incompetence on his part, recognizing his genuine religious motivation and personal sacrifices. The most significant long-term impact of the Seventh Crusade didn't really play out in Europe, but in Egypt. The Ayyubid Sultanate, which was already weakened by succession challenges during the campaign, collapsed shortly after Louis left. Power shifted to the Mamluks, elite Turkish slave soldiers who had been crucial in defeating the Crusaders at Mansoura. Under leaders like Baybars, who rose to prominence during Louis's conflict, the Mamluks would go on to establish a military dynasty that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Seventh Crusade shows both continuity and change in the crusading movement. Louis's strategy in Egypt echoed the approach of the Fifth Crusade, reflecting a memory of strategic priorities. But his careful planning, extended commitment, and focus on defensive consolidation rather than launching more attacks showed he learned from past failures. For those watching at the time, the defining feature of the expedition was Louis's personal faith and commitment. Even with the military setback, his crusading image became tied to the ideal of Christian kingship. When he embarked on a second expedition in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, his ongoing dedication only solidified his reputation as a symbol of crusading idealism, which eventually led to his canonization in 1297. From a military standpoint, the failure of the Seventh Crusade highlighted that even top-notch leadership, solid preparation, and ample resources couldn't overcome the fundamental strategic and environmental challenges posed by Egypt. The geography of the Nile Delta, with its intricate waterways and seasonal flooding, gave defenders significant advantages that Western military tactics simply couldn't handle. This reality would shape future crusade planning, leading to fewer expeditions aimed directly at Egypt. Perhaps the most surprising outcome of the Seventh Crusade was its unintended consequences, particularly speeding up the Mamluk rise to power in Egypt. This shift fundamentally changed the power dynamics in the region, creating a military regime specifically organized for fighting against both Crusaders and Mongols. Under Mamluk leadership, Muslim forces systematically reduced the remaining Crusader holdings over the following decades, ultimately wiping out the Latin presence entirely by 1291. So, Louis IX's First Crusade ended up being a double-edged sword. It helped preserve the Crusader States in the short term through his rebuilding efforts, but it also sped up their long-term decline by paving the way for the Mamluk rise. This outcome shows just how complex the impact of crusading was, where immediate goals and long-term effects often went in unexpected directions, reshaping Mediterranean politics in intricate ways. The 16 years after Louis IX returned from the Holy Land saw a serious decline in the Crusader States situation. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had gained power in Egypt after the Seventh Crusade, expanded its control across the Levant under Sultan Baybars, a former slave soldier who climbed the ranks through his military skill. Baybars was not just tactically smart. He had a strategic vision, targeting Crusader strongholds while also dealing with any potential Mongol threats from the east. Baybars's campaigns systematically chipped away at Crusader territories and fortifications. Caesarea and Arsuf fell in 1265, and then Safed and Torn followed in 1266. The capture of Jaffa in March 1268 took out a key coastal stronghold, and the fall of Antioch in May hit hard psychologically. By 1270, the First Crusader State, established after the First Crusade, was completely wiped out. Christian control had shrunk to just a few coastal cities, with Acre becoming the increasingly vulnerable capital of a fragmented realm. Desperate news of these disasters made its way to Europe through appeals from Crusader state leaders and military orders. Pope Clement IV issued calls for crusades, but the response from Europe was pretty limited. Most monarchs were caught up in their own internal issues or regional conflicts, and the excitement for crusading had faded after so many failures. Even the fall of Antioch, with reports of 17,000 people killed and thousands more enslaved, didn't spark a coordinated European response. In the midst of this crisis, Louis IX of France stepped in. Now in his mid-50s and not in great health, he still held a deep commitment to the ideals of crusading and a genuine interest in the fate of the Holy Land. His decision to launch a second expedition caught many by surprise, especially those who thought his earlier defeat and ransom were enough to fulfill his crusading obligations. But Louis's personal faith and sense of unfinished duty pushed him to move forward. He announced his new crusade at a Paris assembly in March 1267. His initial recruitment efforts targeted the French nobility, many of whom had joined him on his first expedition. The response was mixed. Some veterans jumped right in, while others were hesitant due to past experiences. To boost participation, Louis got his sons and brothers to take crusading vows, turning the expedition into a family affair that many leading nobles felt they couldn't decline. Louis set about preparing for the crusade, following the same careful approach as before. He implemented new taxes, stocked up on supplies, and commissioned specialized transport ships. However, this time the preparation period was shorter, 3 years instead of 4, and financial resources were tighter, reflecting the French crown's struggles after years of funding the Holy Land and the general public's waning enthusiasm for crusade taxes. A crucial development emerged during planning discussions: disagreement over the expedition's target. Louis initially favored returning directly to the Holy Land or Egypt, consistent with traditional crusading objectives. However, his brother Charles of Anjou, who had acquired the Kingdom of Sicily in 1266, advocated strongly for an attack on Tunis in North Africa. Charles presented multiple rationales for the Tunis target. Charles had some solid reasons for wanting to target Tunis. First off, it would put pressure on Egypt from the west and might even set up a base for future operations against them. Plus, economically speaking, Tunis had fallen behind on tribute payments to Sicily, which was hitting Charles right in the wallet. There was also some chatter that the Hafsid ruler of Tunis, Al-Mustansir, was thinking about converting to Christianity. He might have been open to some help that would make that happen. But let's be real. Modern historians are pretty skeptical about this claim. It seems more likely that it was either a clever spin from Charles or a misunderstanding in diplomatic talks. Still, Louis found the idea of helping a Muslim ruler convert to Christianity really appealing. For him, crusading was all about pushing the boundaries of Christianity, not just grabbing land. So, the expedition set sail from Aigues-Mortes on July 1st, 1270, with around 10,000 men packed into Genoese ships. The group included a hefty chunk of French nobility, along with some folks from Catalonia, Friulia, and other Italian cities. They made a quick pit stop in Cagliari, Sardinia, for some last-minute planning before heading to the ancient site of Carthage near Tunis. arriving on July 18, 1270. But things didn't go as planned. Instead of a warm welcome, the Crusaders were met with hostility from local forces. There was no sign of the ruler being open to Christianity. Instead, Hafsid troops harassed them during their landing, avoiding any major confrontations. The Crusaders managed to set up a beachhead and even took over the unoccupied Carthage archaeological site, which gave them a nice elevated spot for a fortified camp. From there, Louis seemed ready to spark a decisive battle with the Tunisian forces, hoping for a big win, or at least some negotiating power. As July turned to August, conditions further deteriorated. On August 3rd, the papal legate fell ill and died. By August 10th, Louis himself contracted what contemporary sources described as a flux of the stomach, accompanied by high fever, likely dysentery complicated by typhoid or typhus. As his condition worsened, Louis reportedly continued conducting royal business and offering spiritual counsel to those around him. On August 25, 1270, Louis IX passed away in his tent, reportedly lying on a bed of ashes as a final gesture of humility. His last words, as recorded by his confessor Geoffrey of Beaulieu, were simply, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." This poignant farewell captured his lifelong dedication to the crusading cause while highlighting the unfulfilled promises of his reign. The king's death sparked an immediate leadership crisis. His eldest son and heir, Philip III, was on the expedition, but was seriously ill himself. Charles of Anjou, who arrived from Sicily the day after Louis's death, took command of the demoralized and disease-stricken forces. Recognizing the expedition's untenable situation, Charles negotiated a treaty with Al-Mustansir that could be seen as a face-saving measure rather than a defeat. The terms included a significant indemnity payment from the Hafsid ruler to cover the Crusaders' expenses, better treatment for Christian merchants and residents in the Tunis region, permission for Christian missionary activities within Hafsid territories, restoration of tribute payments to Sicily that had been put on hold. While this agreement secured some commercial benefits for Charles's Sicilian kingdom, it had little to do with traditional crusading goals. No land changed hands, no strategic advantage against Egypt was gained, and the advancement of Christianity was minimal, limited to a few missionary permissions. The Crusader force left North Africa in November 1270, carrying Louis's remains. Their return journey was another disaster. A severe storm hit the fleet near Trapani, Sicily, sinking several ships and drowning about 4,000 men, nearly half the remaining force. Among the casualties was Louis's brother-in-law, King Thibaut II of Navarre, along with his wife, Isabella, who was also Louis's daughter. The remnants of what was once a grand expedition gradually scattered, with most French nobles heading straight home instead of going to the Holy Land. Philip III recovered from his illness and escorted his father's remains back to France, where Louis was buried at Saint Denis alongside previous French monarchs. Meanwhile, Prince Edward of England, the future Edward I, who had planned to join Louis's crusade, arrived in North Africa after the main force had already left. Undeterred by the expedition's failure, Edward continued with his smaller group to Acre in 1271, a move that some historians refer to as the Ninth Crusade. His limited efforts didn't bring about any significant territorial changes, but did provide a brief boost to the morale of the Crusader States before he returned to England in 1272. The Eighth Crusade is often considered the least effective of the major crusading expeditions. Unlike previous campaigns that at least reached their intended targets before failing, Louis's final crusade never engaged its ultimate objective. Whether Tunis was truly the intended target or just a stepping stone toward Egypt or the Holy Land, the entire operation consumed vast resources while having little strategic impact on the increasingly desperate situation of the Crusader States. For those at the time, the most significant outcome of the expedition was Louis IX's death. While his demise on crusade symbolized tactical failure, it also carried deep spiritual significance that enhanced his sanctified image. Pope Boniface VIII canonized Louis in 1297, with his crusading activities forming a key part of his saintly reputation. Saint Louis became the embodiment of the ideal Christian king, a ruler who prioritized spiritual commitments over material interests, even at the cost of his life. However, the limited successes of the campaign must be weighed against its considerable costs. Beyond the financial burden, the crusade resulted in thousands of deaths among Europe's military elite, further depleting the leadership resources needed for the defense of the Holy Land. The diversion to Tunis, whether driven by Charles of Anjou's economic interests or genuine strategic calculations, consumed valuable time and manpower that could have directly reinforced the struggling Crusader states facing Baybars's relentless campaigns. Looking at the bigger picture, the Eighth Crusade highlights the evolution of the crusading movement by the late 13th century. The expedition's mixed motivations combining traditional religious goals with dynastic interests, commercial considerations, and diplomatic maneuvering reflected the increasing complexity of crusading as an institution. The clear purpose that characterized the First Crusade had evolved into multifaceted endeavors, serving various agendas simultaneously. This campaign also showcased the widening gap between the ideals of crusading and its practical execution. Louis IX embodied a genuine religious commitment to the principles of crusading, yet his expedition was heavily influenced by his brother's political and economic interests. This tension between spiritual motivation and material considerations had always been present in the crusading movement but became more pronounced in later expeditions as political and economic factors gained more importance. For the Hafsid dynasty ruling Tunis, the Crusader attack ultimately bolstered their regional position despite the initial chaos. The negotiated settlement with Charles of Anjou, while imposing financial costs, affirmed their diplomatic importance and established more structured relationships with European powers. This episode accelerated the Hafsid realm's integration into Mediterranean diplomatic and commercial networks, albeit on terms that increasingly favored European interests. In the broader Islamic world, the Eighth Crusade barely registered compared to Baybars's ongoing campaigns in the Levant. The Mamluk Sultan continued his systematic reduction of Crusader territories throughout 1270 to 1271, largely unaffected by events in North Africa. The fundamental strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean remained unchanged by Louis's final crusading effort. For the Crusader states, the Eighth Crusade was yet another example of misdirected European assistance. While desperate pleas from Acre had helped motivate Louis's expedition, the diversion to Tunis meant that no reinforcements reached the threatened Christian enclaves. This pattern of crusading forces, pursuing goals that were tangential to the immediate survival needs of the Crusader states, had recurred throughout the 13th century, contributing to the growing disconnect between European crusading activities and the political realities in the Levant. The most lasting impact of the Eighth Crusade came not from its military or political outcomes, but from its contribution to Louis IX's legacy as a saint. Saint Louis became the ideal model of crusading kingship. His failed expeditions transformed into spiritual victories through the power of hagiography. This idealized image influenced European royal ideology for centuries, especially in France, where Louis's reputation as a crusader reinforced the connections between monarchy, national identity, and religious mission. Yet beneath this glorified narrative lay a more complex reality. A costly expedition that failed to achieve its ultimate goal, diverted resources from more pressing needs, and illustrated the crusading movement's growing disconnect from its original purpose. Like the crusading ideal itself, Louis's final expedition represented both genuine spiritual aspiration and the practical limitations of realizing religious vision through military means in an increasingly complicated political landscape. The Ninth Crusade, often seen as an extension of the Eighth, was the last big expedition to the Holy Land led by a European monarch. It was spearheaded by Prince Edward of England, who later became King Edward I. This short campaign marked the end of the classic era of crusading and hinted at the changing European approach to engaging with the Middle East in the years to come. Edward, the son of King Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, had joined the crusade alongside Louis IX during the French king's efforts to rally support for the Eighth Crusade. A tall and commanding figure with plenty of military experience from campaigns in England and Wales, Edward brought around 1,000 men to play a supporting role in Louis's mission. However, when Edward's force arrived in Tunis in November 1270, they found that Louis had died, the French army was retreating, and the original goal of the crusade had been abandoned. Instead of heading back to Europe with the French, Edward made a bold choice to push on to the Holy Land with his smaller group. This decision showcased his personal commitment to the crusading ideals and a savvy recognition of the political benefits at stake. By keeping his crusading vow, Edward boosted his reputation for religious devotion and chivalric values traits that were highly regarded in medieval leadership. Plus, this journey gave him crucial insights into Mediterranean politics that would shape his future reign in England. Edward's group sailed from North Africa to Sicily, where they spent the winter gathering more recruits and supplies. By spring 1271, they had grown a bit, adding various European nobles and their followers. They eventually made their way to Acre, the capital of the remaining Kingdom of Jerusalem. Arriving in May 1271, what Edward found in Acre was pretty grim. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars had been systematically taking over Crusader territories since 1265, controlling most of the interior, including Jerusalem, Antioch, and many former Christian strongholds. The Crusader presence had shrunk to a narrow coastal strip that included Acre, Tyre, Sidon, and a few smaller holdings. Even this limited territory was under constant threat from Mamluk raids and economic blockades. Despite leading the largest Western force to reach the Holy Land in years, Edward realized his resources were still not enough for major offensive actions against Baybars. The Crusader States could only offer limited military support, their fighting strength weakened by years of losses and immigration. The military orders Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights had solid fighting units, but were more focused on defending their remaining castles than launching risky field campaigns. Given these challenges, Edward crafted a diverse strategy, blending limited military operations, diplomatic efforts, and defensive preparations. This included raids into Muslim-controlled areas around Acre and Nazareth in June and July 1271, which were tactically successful but didn't lead to any lasting territorial gains. Diplomatic outreach was key for Edward, especially toward potential allies like the Mongol Ilkhanate under Abaka Khan. The Mongols controlled Persia and parts of Mesopotamia, sharing a common dislike for the Mamluks. They had even been in talks with European leaders about teaming up for military action. Edward also focused on strengthening the fortifications in the remaining Crusader territories, particularly around Acre, to boost defenses after he left. This practical approach showed how crusading had shifted from the grand dreams of total victory seen in the First Crusade to a more realistic strategy of managing limited goals within tight resource limits. One of Edward's biggest military moves happened in November 1271, when a small Mongol force entered northern Syria, opening up a chance for some coordinated action. Edward led a raid toward Khakum, just south of Acre, hoping to distract the Mamluk forces and stop them from concentrating against the Mongol advance. While he had some tactical success, the overall strategy didn't pan out. Baybars quickly defeated the Mongol force before it could team up with Edward's men, highlighting the Mamluk military's superior speed and organization. After this setback, Edward turned his attention more toward diplomacy. In May 1272, he struck a truce with Baybars that lasted for 10 years, 10 months, and 10 days. This agreement protected the remaining Crusader possessions while acknowledging the current territorial setup, basically recognizing Mamluk dominance while giving some temporary security to Christian coastal enclaves. During these negotiations, Edward faced a life-threatening moment that has become one of the most talked about episodes of his crusade. On June 17, 1272, an Ismaili envoy, who had been part of Edward's household for months, attacked him with a poisoned dagger. Edward managed to kill the assassin, but suffered a wound that sources at the time described as potentially fatal. Historians still debate the details. Medieval Christian accounts claimed Baybars orchestrated the attack, while some modern scholars think it might have been a private Ismaili initiative or even a made-up story to boost Edward's reputation. Regardless of its origin, surviving this incident helped build Edward's heroic image. His wife Eleanor reportedly sucked poison from the wound, a romantic touch that sounds great, but was probably unlikely in medical terms, yet it made for powerful storytelling in chivalric circles. While he was recovering from this injury, Edward received news that changed everything for his crusade. His father, Henry III, had died on November 16, 1272, making Edward the new King of England. This meant he had to head back to secure his throne, especially with ongoing political tensions after the Second Barons' War. So, on September 24, 1272, Edward left Acre, marking the end of the last major crusading expedition. In terms of territorial gains, Edward's crusade didn't achieve much. No significant lands changed hands, no major fortresses were retaken, and the overall strategic balance stayed the same. However, the expedition did give a temporary boost to Christian morale in the remaining Crusader territories and secured a truce that brought about a decade of relative stability, an impressive feat considering their vulnerable situation. One of the most significant outcomes of the Ninth Crusade was that it set diplomatic precedents that would shape future European interactions with Middle Eastern powers. Edward's outreach to the Mongol Ilkhanate was an early example of European powers looking for regional allies against common foes, something that would characterize Western diplomacy in the region later on. The truce with Baybars also hinted at a growing European understanding that political and commercial arrangements might serve their interests better than more military campaigns. For Baybars and the Mamluk Sultanate, Edward's crusade was more of a minor distraction amid their larger strategic concerns. The real threat came from the Mongol forces to the east, not this limited western expedition. Baybars had already made significant gains against the Crusader territories in previous campaigns, so he could afford a temporary truce that allowed him to consolidate his victories and focus on other fronts. The Sultan passed away in 1277, having turned the Mamluk state into the dominant regional power and establishing a military system that would eventually wipe out the remaining Crusader presence. When Edward returned to England, he began a notable reign, 1272 to 1307, marked by legal reforms, parliamentary development, and territorial consolidation. His experiences during the Crusade influenced his kingship, especially his approach to warfare in Wales and Scotland, where he applied lessons in logistics and siege tactics. Edward remained interested in crusading matters throughout his reign, occasionally discussing potential new expeditions, although the practical needs of governance kept him from returning to the Holy Land. After Edward's departure, the Crusader States entered their final phase. The truce negotiated with Baybars provided a temporary breather, but didn't solve their fundamental weaknesses. These territories became increasingly reliant on Italian commercial interests and military order garrisons, functioning more like trade colonies than independent states. Despite some talk among European monarchs about new crusades, no significant expedition took shape before the final collapse. This collapse came under Sultan Kalawan and his son Al-Ashraf Halil, who systematically eliminated the remaining Crusader possessions in the 1280s. Tripoli fell in 1289, followed by smaller coastal holdings. The final siege of Acre began in April 1291, with Mamluk forces vastly outnumbering the city's defenders. Despite desperate resistance from the military orders, Acre fell on May 18, 1291. The last Christian outposts Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Tortosa surrendered or were abandoned shortly after, marking the end of nearly 2 centuries of Latin presence in the Levant. The Ninth Crusade stands as the last chapter in the traditional story of crusading to the Holy Land, while smaller expeditions occurred later, and the rhetoric of crusading continued to fuel European military activities in other areas. No subsequent force matched the scale or ambition of the major numbered crusades. Edward's practical, limited campaign foreshadowed the shift in European engagement with the Eastern Mediterranean, from mainly military religious to more diplomatic commercial approaches. This shift mirrored broader changes in European society, politics, and economic structures. The rise of centralized monarchies focused on territorial consolidation led to less enthusiasm for distant campaigns. Expanding commercial networks created groups that preferred trade relationships over religious warfare. The military orders, having lost their original purpose, evolved into banking, territorial governance in other regions, or merged with national monarchies. The crusading ideal itself didn't vanish, but evolved significantly. The idea of armed pilgrimage and holy warfare against non-believers remained strong in European culture, showing up in various contexts: the Spanish Reconquista, Baltic campaigns against pagans, anti-heretical operations, and eventually European colonial expansion. Each of these maintained elements of the original crusading concept while adapting to new circumstances and goals. For the Islamic world, especially the Mamluk Sultanate, the final victory over Crusader territories was a significant achievement, but didn't bring about major strategic changes. The Latin presence had already shrunk to economically valuable, but militarily weak coastal enclaves before their elimination. The bigger challenge was the Mongol threat from the east, which would continue to influence Mamluk military and diplomatic priorities for many years. The end of the numbered Crusades didn't stop Christian-Muslim interactions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Pilgrimages to holy sites continued under Muslim rule, aided by Franciscan custodianship of key Christian locations. Trade relationships thrived between European merchants and Mamluk authorities. Diplomatic exchanges became more sophisticated, with European powers setting up more permanent representation in Muslim capitals. This evolving relationship laid the groundwork for early modern patterns of interaction between Europe and the Middle East. The rise of Ottoman power in the 14th to 15th centuries would create new regional dynamics, but these would unfold within frameworks partly established during the crusading period. European commercial, religious, and diplomatic engagement with the region continued to evolve along paths visible in Edward's practical approach during the final Major Crusade. So, the Ninth Crusade isn't just an endpoint. It marks a transition, the close of a particular phase in Mediterranean history, and the start of new patterns of cross-cultural engagement. Edward's expedition, modest in military terms, highlighted the practical limitations that had taken over the ambitious vision of crusading, while also showcasing the diplomatic and commercial alternatives that would increasingly shape European interactions with the Islamic world in the years to come.